Hi there, welcome to another episode of History of Science and Technology Q&A. So I'm happy to try to answer whatever questions I can about both modern and less modern history of science, both history of science and technology that I've personally been involved in, people I personally know, and things I personally seen happen, and things from the more distant past, and particularly about how do things get to be the way they are today? How do people come to believe the things they come to believe? How does technology come to exist the way it is right now? So a few questions left over from previous times. All right, let's see. All right, I see one just coming in from Icy, asking, why are keyboards the default computer interface? Well, I'm not sure that's entirely history. I think okay, so there's a bunch of things to say about this. How should we interact with machines? Well, we could talk to them. We can organize our thoughts. Let's take it sort of further back intellectually. In a sense, we have thoughts going on in our brains, and we somehow want to communicate those to machines, or we want to communicate those to other people. The thing is that the thoughts going on in one brain with our 100 billion neurons or whatever it is in our brains, they're all different for each different person and for each different set of experiences that we have. So to kind of have a transfer medium to transfer those thoughts to another person or to a machine, there has to be some way of organizing those thoughts that isn't specific to the details of a person, of the internals of a person's brain. And the best way we have to do that right now is with language and human language. I spent lots of effort building computational language, which allows one to take sort of thoughts that we humans have and cast them into a form that is directly understandable by a computer. But basically, the thing worth realizing is that there are sort of internal thoughts going on, and then there's some kind of communication channel, which is language, that takes those 100 billion neurons and has to organize them into something definite that is, in this case, human language. So similarly, there's a question of when we're going to sort of organize our thoughts to communicate them to a computer, what should we do to make that possible? Should we do that by saying things verbally? Should we do that by writing things or typing things? It's not obvious that it's so bad to type things. And it's particularly useful, I think, to have visual feedback. One thing we've been interested in, so when it comes to computational language, there's a question of, can it be spoken? Right now, Wolfram language is a written language that we specify by typing. I've thought about quite a bit, is there a spoken version of it that can be created? It needs some new ideas, which we haven't had yet, about what's the right way to take the syntactic structure of a computational language and turn that into the kinds of things that we're used to saying. Because when we speak in English, for example, we are making use of all these parse trees, and there's a sentence and it's broken into a noun phrase, a verb phrase, a noun phrase, and the verb phrase is broken into an adverb and a verb, and all kinds of other hierarchical structure. And we managed to do that in real time from the beginning of the sentence, grind through to the end of the sentence, even though it's really a tree structured kind of hierarchical thing. And somehow we managed to do that, and our brains are set up so that we can sort of have enough to have these levels of recursion effectively in the structure of the sentence. I mean, it's pretty easy to make up sentences where you can't understand them, you can't generate them. The cat which sat on the mat, which was black, which was this, which was that, which was that. As it gets too deep, more than about 5 levels deep, you'll typically just lose it. You won't know what's going on anymore in that sentence. So, but in our brains, we do manage to have some recursion depth in understanding and generating sentences. And I'm sure there's a way, but I haven't figured it out yet, to use that capability to do the same kind of spoken version of computational language. So, but in any case, right now, our kind of best conduit for communicating with machines tends to be, for anything except sort of short utterances, or things which are just pure narrative text, tends to be typing on a keyboard. And I would say that there's questions about, well, it's very important that we have this kind of visual feedback of seeing what we type. I mean, I remember, that's always been sort of a critical feature of typing things. Now you could ask, why this keyboard and not another? Why the QWERTY keyboard in at least English-speaking countries, and not some other arrangement like the Dvorak keyboard or something like this? My understanding is that in the early days of typewriters, which is where this keyboard layout came from, one issue with a typewriter is when you press a key on a typewriter, there's this metal piece that is the actual thing that has the piece of type on it that's going to hit the ribbon, that's going to press through the ribbon to the piece of paper, and it's going to make that typed letter. But these stalks that you're typing with both hands. And for example, you don't want two stalks to get that are for nearby letters to get, TH, for example, often typed together. And I'm now very confused by this as I think about it, but I'm pretty sure those, gosh, I have to think. Yeah, I think those are typed with different hands. Yes, they are. And I think they come from different sides of the typewriter, its collection of metal stalks. And so they don't get tangled up. And I think there was a certain amount of mechanical arrangement to try and arrange that things were sort of optimized for sort of mechanical typability. I mean, in general, the tradition there back in, what was it, 1830s or something, when Samuel Morse was inventing Morse code, there was some sophistication there in the idea that one would have, an E was a dot, a T was a dash, and then like an S is a dot, right? And as the letters get less common in typical English, they're encoded with longer sequences of dots and dashes. That was kind of an early example of data compression, but it was done with some degree of sophistication, I think. I think also, amusingly enough, there was an effort when telegrams were really a thing, that there was this kind of 140 character limit on telegrams, which was later copied by things like Twitter and so on, as a way to sort of say, well, you can say a certain amount in that space, so to speak. And it was sort of enough for saying many kinds of things. But so I think there was some degree of sophistication in the 1800s. By the late 1800s, all the typewriter stuff was getting standardized about sort of how these things will be arranged. I think it's also a sort of an issue, but I don't think it's well handled in the standard keyboard of, whether you have to move your fingers and whether you can type typical words without moving your fingers. And there's certainly ways to optimize keyboards. In fact, a friend of mine had a company for a while making cell phone keyboards mostly for obscure languages, optimized based on the actual information theory of kind of which letter sequences occur most commonly and which things should be typed together. For a while, I remember in the early 1980s, I remember seeing these chord keyboards where you would kind of keep your fingers in a fixed place on the keyboard, and depending on which chord of keys you pressed, that would correspond to different letters. I was sort of always thought those would catch on, but I think they vanished without trace. I think also stenographers have a system which is more chord oriented, although I don't know exactly how it works. But so I think that the reason that we're, the particular keyboards we have right now are the way they are because that's what people learn. And, they started that way for these reasons of mechanics of typewriters. Obviously, that's not a thing anymore. I had really thought that there would be more soft keyboards by now, where there's kind of an LCD display on each key, and you're sort of able to type based on that. But that hasn't been a thing that has come in very much. I mean, there have been some attempts. I have kind of a collection of computers that didn't make it that I got at one time or another. And there's one weird object where you unfold it and it has a screen and it has another LCD display, which is its keyboard. And I think with some of these kind of oh gosh, what are they? The things that where you can have a sense of touch based on electrical effects on the screen, could give you something which is kind of like a virtual keyboard in terms of feel, although probably without the nice clicking sensation. But they're obviously on phones and with oh, I don't know, there's, what is it, touch bar or something on Macs and so on. There have been attempts to make soft keyboards that phones, it's kind of a necessary thing as far as it goes. But I think this idea that you would sort of press a shift key and it would suddenly go to a different keyboard has not been such a thing. But yeah, so I mean, will voice, at various times people say voice, it's going to come in, voice is going to be everywhere. And voice is useful for some things, but there's plenty of things it's not useful for. And I tend to think that the extra kind of moment of thinking that comes with actually typing something may actually be helpful in formulating one's thoughts, just as I was mentioning earlier, kind of the raw tumble of neuron firings isn't what we use for actual language. We organize our thoughts to communicate them with language. Let's see. There are questions here about Aaron asks, why didn't someone invent the printing press earlier? It seems to have been quite financially valuable. Was an engineering problem or lack of entrepreneurship? I don't know that full history. I mean, I do know that the idea of movable type, which is this notion, I mean, one thing is kind of making the potato print thing where you are carving out something and then you're using that to make kind of a stamp. Obviously, people had stamps forever because that was the thing, the king's seal or whatever was a stamp in sealing wax or something like that. But this notion that you could have a stamp and it was kind of a carved out stamp and you could go, put it even in ink and stamp it out. That was a thing that was around from antiquity, I think. The idea of movable type, the idea that you would have, I remember when I was a kid using an actual letterpress. I guess that's the American name for it. Had a different name in British English, which I now not sure quite what it was actually. But back in the day, right, you would have these pieces of lead type. Each letter was a piece of lead type in a when you were making separation between lines, you get these pieces of lead. That's why it's called leading between lines. You just stick a piece of lead in between these two lines of type, and you'd have these frames where you set the type. It's usually upside down. You usually put the letters in sort of from the first line in upside down first, and it's always kind of fun because you would have the lowercase and the uppercase of letters, and that's why it's called uppercase and lowercase. The E was always the biggest piece of type and of font characters, and then the Z was a small one, and so on. You pick them all out and you arrange them, and sometimes you'd have to put you tie them with string so that you keep them from falling out, and then you'd put them in an actual printing device, and then you'd have this sort of plate of lead type, and then it sort of goes on a piece of ink, and then it goes down on a piece of paper, and that's how you could print things. It was really worked quite nicely. But that idea of movable type, of being able to take individual pieces of type and set them to be able to print from. I don't know why that idea didn't originate earlier. It's certainly the notion of sort of carving out pieces of lead certainly should have existed. I don't think there was any precision engineering that was needed. The lead didn't fit together perfectly. Lead is a nice soft metal, so you could squash it and get the things to sort of form correctly. I would say that the big innovation that was from the early part of the let's see, that must have been 1930s-ish, was photolithography. So originally, when you would set type, you would be like every letter would be individually picked out, and you set the type and you print whatever you print, and then you take it all apart again and put the pieces of type back in their upper and lower cases, so to speak, and you recycle them for another day. By the way, I mean in old books when they were printed, people would regularly, they print them off pretty slowly. And so when there was a typo that was noticed, people would just go in and pull out that piece of lead type and put in another one and then keep printing. I remember years ago, I was sort of curious about this because I was considering buying an original edition of Newton's Principia from 1687. And as sort of a question of, well, there were about, I think, 1,500 copies of that book are thought to have been printed, and maybe 500 of them have known locations in today's world, 350 years later. So there's sort of a question of when those 1,500 copies were printed, in what order were they printed? Because in the kind of concept of things like the antiquarian book world, if your copy was printed very early in the print run, then it's more valuable than one that was printed, systematically later. And the thing that was kind of confusing was when it was printed, that they would print out all these different sheets, and then when they bound it, they would potentially take a sheet that was printed early that was for page 3, and a sheet that was printed later that was for page 4, and so on. And so it seemed like there wasn't a kind of systematic, this was printed before that. By the way, it's always charming to see in these old books, they will have, it says, this is a book printed by so-and-so, and it's sold on this particular place in, Paternoster Row in London, and things like this. You can buy it, be behind the church in such and such a place, and so on. Very, very specific. And that's sort of the tradition that led people in kind of citation styles to say, published by, where they would, instead of just saying, Addison Wesley Publishing Company or something, they would say, Reading, Massachusetts, Addison Wesley Publishing Company. And I think that was kind of a holdover from the days when of really old books, where it would be like, you buy it from the specific guy with a stall in this particular place. It's sort of funny, by the time there are these global publishing companies and you're still listing, Reading, Massachusetts is the location, as if somebody would go there to actually get this book. I remember when I was actually with that specific publishing company, Addison Wesley, when we were publishing the first edition of the Mathematica book, I remember talking to some people there and saying, have you ever actually seen the printing press that prints these things? Oh, no, we've been working in publishing for 30 years. We've never actually seen a printing press. So, times change. But in any case, the big innovation of, I think, the 1930s was photolithography, the ability to have instead of setting type one letter at a time, to be able to have essentially a photographic representation, essentially a photograph, and then to use that photography to do lithography, as in you basically take that photograph, and it's a picture of the page you want to make, and then it's something where you etch away a plate in every place where there, for example, where it isn't black in the thing that, you want to etch it away where it isn't black on the thing you're trying to print. So that means you're etching it away. So the parts that are etched away aren't raised. The parts that aren't etched away are raised. And so when you put it in ink, you'll get those raised parts with the things that pick up the ink and the things you print. And so that was kind of what allowed you to have sort of from a picture to printing by doing that kind of etching with acid, based on, you would have something that is light sensitive, and then you etch it away with acid. It's the same process that's used in lithography for making microprocessors, where you're etching away layers of silicon rather to create a kind of circuit, rather than etching away layers of your printing plate. I guess that's what's called offset printing, or lithography, but I'm not quite sure why. Don't actually know why it's called offset printing. But in any case, before that time, when there were illustrations in books, they would typically be things like woodcuts. And woodcuts are, you take a piece of wood and you chisel out the parts that aren't supposed to print, and then you put it in ink and you print it in the book, so to speak. So that was kind of let's see, that's kind of the concept there. Now, I mean, I can say, and by the way, someone said here that it's called offset printing because the image doesn't go directly from like in a letterpress or something, directly from the thing you set to the paper, but it's transferred to some other surface as an intermediary. I have certainly seen printing presses. I've seen the ones that, for example, I haven't seen the one the NKS book was printed on, but I have seen ones that we've used for printing other kinds of things. I mean, just to say a little bit more about printing technology, big thing is 4-color printing or 6-color printing or whatever else. The idea is you can break down any color for colors made with light. Red, green, blue are the primary colors. The complements of those colors, cyan, magenta, yellow, and cyan, magenta, and yellow are the colors relevant for ink, for light that is going to be reflected rather than light that's going to be emitted. And so sort of the way that people make color printing is done with cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And if you look under a magnifying glass or something, you'll see this little detailed pattern. And what happens is there's an array of dots that are associated with each color, and they're at different angles, and they're at 3 non-commensurate angles that so that you end up getting something which has a nice uniform covering of dots. If those angles were wrong, you get moiré patterns, and you would start seeing these sort of weird effects. But you don't see that because those angles are non-commensurate. And you see, and also there's this notion of screening. So in a typical book, I can't remember, I think the NKS book was printed with a much finer screen, like 150 lines per inch screen, which means when you turn the color into dots, how far apart are those dots? That's something where different kinds of printing do it differently. And usually what happens is, sometimes with fancy magazines, you'll have 6-color printing, where in addition to cyan, magenta, yellow, you'll have a few other colors. Sometimes you also have so-called spot colors, where as well as those so-called process colors, the ones that into which any red, green, blue can be broken, you also have, I'm really, my corporate color is purple. I'm going to print with a spot color of purple and just have a great big, nice bar of solid purple, not made from a combination of red and blue, for example, from the dots. I don't, in fact, know exactly when 4-color printing came in. I guess it became really popular by the time magazines were being printed in the 1930s, 1940s, things like that. A lot of printing equipment, a previous generation of printing equipment, a lot of it dated from the 1940s and so on. But I will say, in terms of, there was this question, the original question was, why weren't printing presses invented earlier? I don't know. I don't think they were engineering. I don't think there was a big engineering issue. There may have been issues with, there are certainly questions about why would one want to do this? How would one do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. For a while, I mean, in many places, the printing was thought to be a very dangerous technology, because it's like, if you can print, you can, print things and pin them on every church door or whatever. You can print something and make many copies of it, and that allows you to disseminate information in a more efficient way. And it has been, well, sadly or happily, depending on how you look at it, it's been a feature throughout history that governments have tended to be nervous about people disseminating information. It's because it's like, who's in charge here type thing. But I think so the printing press was for a long time something where you kind of had to have a license to operate a printing press, and people would be, and there were things where, like for example, in England, I think there were just specific places, like I think Oxford and Cambridge's university presses were the only places that were licensed to print the Bible. But it was something where there was a lot of sort of licensing around it. I mean, it's it's funny how these things change over time. It's like at different times, like you still have to have a fancy license. I think it's become a little less fancy these days to operate like a television station or a radio station in the US. And in China, you'd have to have a license to run a website, and with a government identification number and all those kinds of things. It's been different in different places at different times, but time was when to operate a printing press, you had to have kind of a license from the government. I think that so I don't know exactly how that played into the development of early printing and its spreading, but that's a little bit on printing. I should tell a little bit of a story about printing. A place where I got to know more about it than I might have ever wanted to know. When I wrote this big book, New Kind of Science, that came out almost 20 years ago now, the book involves a lot of very high resolution pictures. And we wanted to get these nice cellular automaton pictures printed at very high resolution. And so we had sort of very exacting specifications for the paper and the printing press and so on. And turned out we were using a technology there that was really quite a new technology, which was so-called direct-to-plate printing, where instead of using a film where you would have sort of a photographic image of the page, and you would do this, expose it to light and do this etching and all that kind of thing. Instead, direct-to-plate printing was basically a laser that scans a plate, much like a laser printer has that kind of scanning idea for in the case of sort of locally for the laser printer, but this is now scanning a plate that is going to be the plate that's used for printing. And so we were using that technology. I actually have a bunch of the plates that we used for the NKS book sitting somewhere in my archive. They're these big, okay, so there are two fundamental kinds of printing. Sheet-fed presses and so-called web presses, which have nothing to do with the World Wide Web. They're called web presses for a different reason. Sheet-fed presses, you basically print a signature of pages, maybe 16 pages at a time, and there's a big plate that has all those pages laid out, and you have a big sheet of paper, and you print it, and you get all those pages printed, and then to make the book, you cut those pages up and you actually fold them up usually, and then you stitch them into the book, so to speak, or you glue them into the book. That's sheet-fed press. And there's sort of page at a time, signature at a time printing. A web press involves a continuous stream of paper. And these are giant machines that I guess they're used to print newspapers as well, but they're also used to print books. And it's a giant machine where there's paper going at, I don't know, 200 miles an hour or something through this machine. And it's printing. And it really doesn't make sense to do a print run like that unless you're printing a decent number, a few thousand copies or something. And once you have it sort of launched, it's going to print that stuff and it'll all be done in a very short amount of time. But those are kind of the two principal technologies, I think, that end up getting used. So, for example, the NKS book was sort of unusual in popular books where there were quite large print runs in being done on a sheet-fed press, because you have a lot more control on a sheet-fed press. If you see, oh, this thing is too light on one side, let's put more ink on that side of the printing plate, you can do that. But with a web press, the paper's going at 200 miles an hour, and you've printed the whole book by the time you even thought about adjusting the flow of ink or something. So anyway, it was being printed on a sheet-fed press using this technology of direct-to-plate printing, laser direct-to-plate printing. Okay, all great. And it was being printed at a printing company in Canada. It's a very common place to do high-quality printing, either in Canada or in the Far East. So, we're ready to do this, but with direct-to-plate printing, one wasn't able to get the same kind of proofs that one could get with this sort of film-based printing, where you'd get, you'd see something that was printed from the film, and then it would get transferred to the plate, and then it would be printed, and so on. So anyway, we sent a person up to Canada to go look at the plates just to check them before they were going to get printed. And it's a good and careful person. And he said, well, actually, this plate, this particular cellular automaton image, which he knew was supposed to be a symmetrical, a left-right symmetrical image, it's not left-right symmetrical on this plate. How could that be? And so big kind of help, how much has gone wrong here kind of thing. So we look into this, and it was actually over a holiday weekend in 2002. This was all happening, and it was a big sort of problem, because how many of these plates were going to be wrong? How could we even get the plate correct? What had happened, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was kind of interesting because the company that, well, I forget how, but somehow I got in touch with the CTO of the company that made the direct-to-plate printing system, and also it was a system that ran through PostScript. And I also had known the founders of Adobe created PostScript, and I got in touch with one of them too, and said, "Hey, what's going on?" And the person who made the kind of raster was responsible for the kind of laser raster system. Said, "Oh, it must be a bug in our laser raster, kind of system," because that was the piece he'd made. And the PostScript people said, "Well, maybe it's a bug in PostScript." Turns out it was a bug in PostScript, and it had been there for like a decade. And it was a bug because people weren't used to making very high resolution kind of raster images that weren't photographs. Usually there were photographs with sort of continuous gradation of colors, but when you're making the cellular automaton image, there's black, white at the full resolution of the image. And that was something that wasn't correctly accounted for in a version of the so-called image operator in PostScript. So it was kind of a remarkable thing that one sort of had to drill all the way down to get that information. And so we got the bug, we worked around the bug, and the book was printed correctly, and it's all good. And they're just, I think I have a copy of the plate that was the one before the glitch was fixed, so to speak. But anyway, the thing that actually when we printed the NKS book, we printed a bunch of copies, maybe 100,000 copies initially, and then turned out we needed more. And that was, I forget all the details of this. That was let's see, that was all happening in a very elaborate way at some time that was very inconvenient in the summer of the early summer of 2002. And the NKS book came out on May 14th. So sometime around then. In any case, it was kind of interesting to know the supply chain for the book. Because we had picked this particular kind of paper. It's called Finch VHF, very, very fine paper or something. And it came from a paper mill in upstate New York, which I think came from trees that were, it's like, this book is going to come from trees. Well, those actual trees were somewhere in upstate New York, and it was a particular kind of tree that was turning into this kind of paper through a paper mill in upstate New York. And then it was actually being printed. The book was being printed in Winnipeg, Canada. And then it was being bound in Toronto. And then it had to make its way to the distribution centers for Amazon and Barnes & Noble and folks like that, which were in places like Memphis, Tennessee. And so there was this big claim of, oh, it just can't be done. We can't get sort of the, we can't get books to this place quickly enough, and so on. So this is my one moment of doing sort of operations research kinds of things. It's like, how far is it to go by truck from here to there? When can we get a slot in the schedule for the binding place for the bindery, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the book made its way from raw paper in upstate New York to printing in Winnipeg, to binding in Toronto, to distribution in Memphis, And somehow that was all achieved with, there was some other issue with, but I remember working out the trucking distances and all kinds of issues like that. Because one feature of books is they're pretty big. And by the time you're talking about tens, hundreds of thousands of books, that's a lot of truck volume to move around the place. And so I'm afraid I have to say that I won't name the retailer right now, but there was a sad feature of the NKS book as it was sort of climbing on bestseller lists and things. You kind of have to keep the momentum of sales going, and you have to feed the distribution channel. And a retailer whose name I won't specifically mention managed to lose a complete container of books, the complete a complete semi-truck worth of books for like a week. And exactly how you lose a thing like that is unclear to me. But it was something that happened, because when you make these things, they tell you, label them. I don't know how it works right now because I haven't done something like this recently, but it's like label it with the right barcodes and things, and it will arrive at a loading dock, and then it'll get unpacked and hopefully go off and get distributed and so on. But kind of a shame, because otherwise we would have peaked higher on the bestseller lists by a significant amount. I think had a whole container of books not been lost and not made it through the distribution channel at that with the right momentum, so to speak, to sort of peak in those lists like that. Okay, let's see. Oh my. All right, there's a question here from Memes. In my opinion, if physics hadn't worked out for Professor Feynman, would he have been able to make it as a stand-up comedian? I'm not enough of an expert in stand-up comedy, so I don't think I could give a really informed opinion of that. I think Dick Feynman was always a good presenter and a good explainer of things. And he also liked he was quite the thespian. I never saw him in he would be, have various kinds of parts in student plays at Caltech and so on. I have to say, I never went to a single one of those plays. So I can't speak to his thespian qualities and abilities. I think it wasn't, I will say that in terms of sort of pop culture, I don't think Dick Feynman was quite as up on that as people might have been. I have to say, I remember this one terrible incident where there's the theoretical physics seminar, actually probably one that I organized at Caltech. This must have been 1981, 2-ish type time frame. And Dick Feynman had a terrible habit of sort of trying to figure out what the magic flaw. I mean, in fact, he had this competition going with me to try and find sort of who could figure out the fatal flaw in what was being said first. And anyway, one of these seminars was going on, and Dick Feynman had a friend who was also a friend of mine, Rick Field, who and somehow, I don't know, Dick Feynman and Rick Field had been discussing, somehow they were describing things in terms of turkeys and people being kind of turkeys, and as in kind of, not getting it, kind of dumb and so on. And so, but Dick Feynman didn't know that the term turkey was a general term for, being dumb type thing. So anyway, so in one of these talks, at some moment he says to Rick Field in quite sort of in plain, audible form, something like, "It's time to pass the cranberry sauce," thinking that was kind of an encoded version of, I think this guy, this person is a turkey. Of course, it wasn't so encoded, because in knowledge of pop culture would reveal that the turkey idea was a very popular meme, so to speak. So I'm afraid that was a Dick Feynman not quite in touch with the memes of the day kind of thing. And I think I mean, he was certainly somebody who liked, particularly in his earlier years, liked the kind of prankish type of thing. I would say he was not a, a telling jokes. I'm trying to remember whether I ever heard him. Oh my gosh, let me think about this for a second. I mean, he would sometimes imitate people who he thought were, he was not he wasn't. I would say that he would tend to make fun of kind of the experts saying these very erudite things and not understanding the core point. And I'm afraid one of the people he would often make fun of was Murray Gell-Mann, the person who invented quarks, who had an office sort of right next door with an assistant in between the two of them, but to him for many, many years. And Murray was a very kind of erudite, pronounced every word perfectly. And Dick Feynman was definitely the coarser New York, Brooklyn type accent type person. And Murray would always be expressing these sort of names from other languages in these very carefully pronounced ways. And Dick Feynman would always make fun of this and imitate Murray and sort of imitate some strange, thing where he would sort of claim that Murray was making some sound which was, involved you sort of spitting everything out to make the sound or something like this. So he would tend to make terrible fun of sort of the erudite, so to speak. And I think he always believed in kind of breaking things down into their sort of simplest parts. I kind of like that too. But I think his patience for sort of the erudite and the expert was never very high, and he would certainly imitate things that people would say, which were, where they were, he would talk about things. I don't know. He'd been on a textbook commission, for example, and he was very unhappy about, people telling him, I can't remember the specifics of, but Professor Feynman, nobody will understand that. And he would sort of explain that in a very, in a way where he was kind of imitating the way, he was not a great mimic, but it was amusing that he would sort of try and give the full kind of version of what was said as an imitation, so to speak. So I would say my overall rating would be great expositor of science, not great stand-up comedian. But I'm not really completely sure what it takes to be a great stand-up comedian. Okay, a couple of questions here. One from Frost. Question is, how much science and technology isn't published or publicly available? Is the most advanced science in the published literature and in patents and things like that? Are there branches of science that are secret? Am I personally sitting on any such things or know about ones that are not kind of public facing? That's kind of changed over time. I mean, I think that the world has sort of become more, with the web and who knows what, even live streaming and all these kinds of things, a lot has become more visible than it once was. I mean, back in the day, and it's also the case that there's a question of who's sort of leading in the science and technology charge. And, for when governments have been leading the charge, as happened in the time of the Second World War and in the kind of the Sputnik era, up through the Cold War, so to speak, or up to substantial part of the Cold War, there was a lot more tendency for the greatest science to be kind of sort of proprietary to the government, so to speak, and secret and so on. I think in these days, there tends to be a lot more kind of companies that it tends to be more in the corporate sector and more in the let me show off about all the wonderful things we have, rather than let's keep it secret and only use it when we're in a war or something. So I don't know. It's over time, different countries have different rules about what has to be kept secret, and whether if you know something that's secret, like in Britain, there's the Official Secrets Act, where, if you know something that's secret, even if you didn't, get a security clearance and make a contract that says you keep things secret, you have to keep things secret. It works a little differently in the US. But over time, it's sort of been interesting to see. Sometimes I know about things that are sort of secret for a while, and either more often in the corporate sector. And I would say that the sort of turnover time of things not being secret anymore seems to be, it's rather short these days. And I don't know, maybe I'm just ignorant of sort of major sort of troves of secret science. Now, there are things that sometimes get done, like one that's often discussed is public key cryptography. And was that invented by the, for example, GCHQ, the British signal intelligence folk? It's a little complicated. I don't know the answer to that, but it's a little complicated because sometimes these things can be invented, but nobody knows their significance. And so you go back later and you say, look, it was invented there, but the whole sort of thing around it wasn't invented. And so, somebody can say, well, so-and-so invented this thing in some secret government situation, and that thing would have turned into Facebook or something. But guess what? It couldn't be deployed as Facebook when it's deep in some secret government thing. So it didn't turn into Facebook, so to speak. So I don't know to what extent those kinds of things have happened. I think that in modern times, well, it's complicated because you talk about patents, there are classified patents, patents where there is some sort of statement of who invented it, but the patent is not out there in the open literature. I don't completely know the status of those in the modern times. For a while, there was quite a lot of activity around those things in areas like cryptography. But the question of is there sort of for example, it's complicated. The sort of, for example, do we even have sort of big areas of science and so on that we're not kind of putting out in public view? At different times in my life, I have had such things. For example, when I was working on my whole New Kind of Science book, that was about a decade of disappearing from public view because I wanted to kind of concentrate on doing that piece of work. And at that time, it was invisible, and people would try and sort of find out what was going on, and did some rather scurrilous things in the process of doing that. And I was like, I just want to concentrate on this. Just leave me alone. I'm just, just private citizen doing a bunch of weird science. Just leave me alone until it's finished. In more modern times, I've been doing sort of the opposite thing of kind of live streaming our working sessions, and it's kind of pretty much all visible. And I would say there's at most weeks delay between, and sometimes 1 day delay between sort of if it's something being done, notebooks that I've created sort of get posted on the web by the next morning type thing. So that's a very, very short turnaround. I think that the notion of kind of core pieces of things that are more basic science being sort of not in the public view, that has tended to become, I think it tends to be the case that they are in the public view, for better or worse. I mean, sometimes there's kinds of science where people can do terrible things by knowing that science. Here's how to make this nasty kind of thing, and everybody knows how to do it, and it's a complicated issue. Whether to what extent sort of it's good for the world to sort of have all that information be widely available, and to what extent it isn't. And in some cases, like for example, nuclear weapons, it's not really enough to know, how do you make an implosion lens? You've also got to get your uranium-235 or whatever, and the supply chain to get that is not an easy one. But there are other cases of technologies where once you sort of know how to do it, it's something much more readily doable. All right, let's see. There's a question here from from Tyler. Why is the Turing machine model so dominant today in theory of computation compared to the equivalent lambda calculus? Well, I know this history fairly well, he says, famous last words. This all has to do with kind of the origins of the idea of universal computation. And it's a big idea, and it's an idea that people almost had multiple times. You know, Gottfried Leibniz almost had it in the very late 1600s. He got pretty close. I don't think he actually had the idea, but, you know, he was writing all these notes, you know, all the time about different things he was thinking of. And he was definitely circling around that with his Characteristica Universalis and things like this. But the idea of there is a fixed machine and it is capable of just being given different starting conditions, essentially different programming, and then do arbitrary different operations. He didn't have that really, although he was sort of circling around it. Charles Babbage with his analytical engine, and Ada Lovelace with her kind of understanding at a more abstract level of the analytical engine, they sort of almost had it in the 1830s. But that kind of disappeared. And then in, I think the first place it really appeared formally was in the work of Moses Schoenfinkel in 1920 with combinators. But that work is very abstract. Was kind of this idea of, we know that, you know, the NAND operation is a way of making any logic expression. Let's make these symbols S and K that can be combined in all different ways to make arbitrary expressions in predicate calculus. And that's sort of, in a sense, to do arbitrary computations. The problem is that Schoenfinkel was an ultra minimalist. He got rid of the idea of variable. He didn't have variables. And he had just these two symbols, S and K, and you put them together and you can do arbitrary computations. I just wrote, in fact, even a book about combinators recently, trying to understand 100 years later how this all works. And combinators are very obscure. And combinators, the core ideas of combinators with symbolic computation, transformation rules, universal computation, these ideas, actually, I personally have made great use of them in language design. Many of those ideas have not been widely used elsewhere. The idea, the final idea of Schoenfinkel's of remove all mention of variables just makes something that us humans just have a really hard time understanding. And so that was 1920. Schoenfinkel did his thing. Nobody really paid attention to it. A person called Haskell Curry came along a few years later and sort of rediscovered what Schoenfinkel had done. And he gradually understood what had been done. And that turned into Curry's combinatory logic. But by the time, and that sort of was one of the strands of doing universal computational, although not a terribly popular one, although Haskell Curry, it turns out, was quite involved in the war effort and in early computers. And I gather actually wrote this thing about about sort of pre-functional programming based on his experience with combinators, but it was never taken up. And instead, the von Neumann kind of procedural programming idea with variables and sort of sequences of instructions and things was taken up. Okay, but we're back, 1920, Moses Schoenfinkel. 1931, Kurt Gödel. Kurt Gödel needed a way to represent sort of arbitrary operations and encode them in arithmetic. Essentially write a compiler that goes from arbitrary things like this statement is unprovable, compiling that down to arithmetic. And for that, he used a trick, these things called general recursive functions. So recursive functions had been kind of invented, Fibonacci in 1202 had an early example of recursion, and people had invented the Fibonacci idea much earlier than that in studies of prosody in India and things like that, probably even in antiquity. But in any case, the idea of recursion was one that was sort of around. And then in the early part, in the 1900-ish time frame, people around David Hilbert had kind of thought, well, we'll formalize sort of what counts as a mathematically constructible function, and it will be primitive recursion. Primitive recursion means you can, a function can depend on earlier values, but it can't do some kind of while loop looking for future values. But what Gödel did was he invented general recursive functions, which can have that so-called mu operator that goes and sort of looks for future values. And he used general recursive functions in the proof of Gödel's theorem in 1931. And that was another place where sort of something which turns out to be capable of universal computation was invented. So that's 1931. Then 1935, Alonzo Church is working on lambda calculus. So lambda calculus is a way of taking, so people had the idea of a function, f of x is x squared, things like that. People had the idea of a mathematical function. People around, well, first Frege in the 1880s, and then Peano, 1890s-ish, then Whitehead and Russell, 1910. All these people had had kind of the idea that you could sort of abstract the pure function. If f of x is x squared, what is f itself? And f itself is just this pure function that is something where you can, what is that? Well, they wrote it as with iotas and epsilons and so on. And Church ended up picking the symbol lambda to represent sort of the pure function. And Church really developed that theory and eventually wrote a paper called An Unsolvable Problem of Number Theory, in which what he was doing was to encode. See, the interest at that time was people wondered, what is mathematics? And people like Hilbert had said, mathematics is just a formal system where in the end, you can break it down into the set of axioms and these formal rules that describe what you do with axioms. And so that was kind of the idea around that time that was then taken up by Whitehead and Russell to just turn all of mathematics into something purely in terms of logic or purely in a sense structural. That was kind of the notion there was, can we take mathematics as mathematics is practiced and break it down into this kind of fundamental pieces? And that was kind of the motivation for many of these things. For Schoenfinkel, it was the motivation for Church. It was the motivation indirectly, well, effectively for Gödel and so on. It was the motivation for all these people was to find these ways to sort of formalize mathematics and break it down into something, whereas Hilbert would say, you didn't really even have to be talking about mathematics as a formal system. You could be talking about tables and chairs instead of numbers and plus signs and so on. I actually think, and have recently come to the conclusion, that the idea of breaking mathematics down in this kind of axiomatic way is actually a mistake and the wrong direction. And I kind of have finally, in a very circuitous route, have come to the belief, which I'll probably talk about a bunch more in the next month or two, about the fact that mathematics, as mathematicians practice it, is kind of like, imagine that all the possible truths of mathematics are like like sort of collisions of molecules in a gas. Mathematics, as mathematicians practice it, is kind of like the fluid dynamics of what's going on, of looking at large scale flows and vortices and things like that. Breaking things down into axioms is kind of like the molecular dynamics, looking at things at the level of individual molecules bouncing around. And there are occasionally cases where you dive down to the molecular level, but the big picture of mathematics is not at that level. But in any case, the idea from Hilbert and Whitehead and Russell and so on is, let's go down to the molecular dynamics. Okay, so in that tradition came Alan Turing in 1936, writing a paper on let's see, on the Entscheidungs problem, which is the decision problem, which is the question of something that was formulated around Hilbert, I think probably formulated it, and people around him developed it. That was kind of the idea of, given a statement in, let's say, number theory or something, can you decide that it is true in some mechanical kind of way? And so what Turing wanted to do was to say, no, you can't decide it's true in a mechanical way. And for that, he produced this much more concrete version of sort of a device for doing mathematics, which was a Turing machine. You know, Church had lambda calculus as a device for doing mathematics. Schoenfinkel had combinators. Gödel had general recursive functions. All these people had essentially devices for doing mathematics. But Turing's one was much easier to understand than the others, and was the one that eventually became very popular. Now, at the time, nobody knew. First of all, it became clear fairly quickly that all these different sort of devices for representing mathematics were equivalent. Nobody knew that those things were what our universe could do. people thought, even Gödel thought, I think Turing thought, Turing suspected that human minds, for example, were not like Turing machines or general recursive functions. They were capable of doing more. Gödel has a footnote where he talks about how human minds can decide things that can't be decided by this axiomatic system he's set up, and talks about a hierarchy of types ramified into the transfinite and so on. That's kind of an obscure kind of idea for how that might work. But in any case, the thing that was not clear at the time, not clear back in the 1930s and so on, is if these things were universal and they all turned out to be equivalent, what did it mean to be universal? Were these things actually kind of universal at the level of that's all you could possibly make, or were they simply what this particular framework of mathematics could provide? I don't think it was until the 1980s, and actually I think it was my own efforts that really highlighted the idea of what could you make in the physical universe? What kinds of computation could our physical universe actually do? And people who believe, physicists, for example, had believed for a long time that, well, there's Turing machines, but when it comes to the physical universe, we're solving differential equations. Even Alan Turing, late in his life in 1952 or so, when he started writing papers about morphogenesis and reaction to fusion equations in biology, he was like, well, that's physics. That's not like a Turing machine. That's like partial differential equations and exact real numbers and things like this. And so that had been really the belief of people in kind of the mathematical sciences. And I think in the 1980s, I pushed pretty hard to understand that there was sort of this computational view of things. I wasn't sure that there would be a ready description of our whole dynamics of physics in computational terms. But what I did think was true was that anything that we humans could realistically observe would be turnable into something which was computational. That if we were going to define an experiment that we could represent symbolically and think about with our minds, that would end up being something that would have a sort of discrete description that could be made computational, so to speak. It's only very recently with our project to find a fundamental theory of physics that I'm now, absolutely convinced that the universe is computational all the way down and equivalent to a Turing machine, so to speak, all the way down. But the historical dynamics is people understood Turing machines better than they understood these other things. There were different communities. I mean, there was a lambda calculus community. There was even a small combinators community. And these people were using those models, and they were kind of, oh, we don't do Turing machines. We do lambda calculus. And even today, for my book about combinators, we made a bibliography of sort of all papers that have been written about combinators that sort of overlaps with the lambda calculus world. There's a whole world of lambda calculus and combinators that's separate from the Turing machine world. But in the 1950s, when people started to think about kind of, so what happened? There was another reason why Turing machines won out, actually. Here's why. So in 1950s, people were starting to think about artificial intelligence and how would brains correspond to these electrical machines that were being invented in computers. Well, there was an important link, which was McCulloch and Pitts, Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts, 1943, I think, wrote their paper about kind of, neural networks, the original neural networks paper, trying to idealize sort of a neural net in terms of something like an electrical machine. And they imagined that our brains were set up like electrical machines with switching equipment and so on. In the earlier few decades, there have been work on kind of the way to think about, people have built electrical machines, electrical networks, electrical circuits. There were switches. There were devices like triodes from vacuum tubes that were switches, that were pure electronic switches, where you put current in one, you put a voltage on one thing, and it's a gate that determines whether current can flow through that. That was originally triodes. Later on, transistors were what was used to do that. But so there was this idea of switching networks, and Claude Shannon had figured out this correspondence between Boolean algebra and switching networks and so on. And there was this idea that was sort of emerging of automata, finite automata, these things where there were a finite number of states of the system that were defined by open this switch, close that switch, and so on. Into that tradition came McCulloch and Pitts with their kind of model of the nervous system. And they pointed right back to Turing and said, look, there's this Turing machine thing. And oh, by the way, it has this universality property, which Turing originally proved in the context specifically of Turing machines. He produced a universal Turing machine that was universal in the sense that it could represent any other Turing machine. He didn't know at that, well, he actually knew at that point that it could also represent lambda calculus. But all these other different forms of models of computation were found to be equivalent later. In any case, so McCulloch and Pitts point to Turing machines. They say it's equivalent to Turing machines, and that's the way that and so then Turing machines kind of become this standard thing to talk about when people are talking about artificial intelligence, and people are thinking about automata and finite automata, then eventually cellular automata. But Turing machines, I think through that route, through McCulloch and Pitts, kind of became the standard thing to talk about. There's a famous book from 1956 about automata studies, I think it's called, edited by John McCarthy, Marvin Minsky, some of those folk, I think Claude Shannon maybe also. That was sort of a founding document of sort of theoretical artificial intelligence. And it's very full of Turing machines. Like there's a paper in there by Claude Shannon showing that you can, in principle, make a universal Turing machine with just 2 states, but it has to have a lot of symbols on its tape. Actually, as I found, in the end, I came up with this Turing machine which has just 2 states and 3 symbols on its tape. And Claude Shannon had been talking about hundreds of symbols on the tape. A person called Alex Smith sort of proved this thing that I thought was true about the fact that the very simplest possible universal Turing machine is 2 colors, 2 states, 3 colors. And that was, but in any case, so by that time, I think the Turing machine was sort of becoming the lingua franca, so to speak, of the emerging theoretical computation. There were a few competitors. Register machines in the 1960s was something when people were talking about compiler design, when that was kind of the highest tech of theoretical computer science. I think register machines were pretty popular because they were, and then things that had more random access memory kinds of models, because Turing machines are like, you want to find that piece of data on the tape. Well, it's actually like an old-fashioned tape drive, like you see in old movies, and I remember seeing in actual computers, where you would have these 9-track tapes that will be twitching back and forth. And, because what was happening was data was written onto the tape. And if you wanted to find a piece of data that had been written a while ago in a different part of the tape actually had to, spin around and get to that point on the tape. And that was kind of like a Turing machine. Well, okay, it's all right. I probably should wrap up soon, but that's, I think, the story of Turing machines, and maybe there was an additional in 1970 when Stephen Cook came up with NP completeness, the idea of NP completeness. That was another kind of Turing machine play to some extent. That was another thing stated in terms of non-deterministic Turing machines. It was actually the first sort of formalization, I think, of non-deterministic Turing machines where it can take one of many possible paths. I mean, I've subsequently been very keen on this idea of multi-way Turing machines, where it, in a sense, takes all possible paths, but that's a different story. Let's see. Aaron is saying, I'd like to read an essay about the printing of the NKS book. Yeah, I almost wrote that, actually. Maybe I should do that now that it's the 20th anniversary. Maybe I should write down what actually happened. I have all the materials. It's kind of some wild things there. Good idea. I think I almost did that at the 10th anniversary. Time to do it now. Well, there's a question here. Oh boy. Oh, there are a couple of really interesting ones here. All right. One from Carup. Is it possible to identify the moment in history when scientific investigation as we know it broke away from the study of philosophy? You know, the early philosophers, particularly the pre-Socratic philosophers, a lot of what they thought philosophy was about was how do we describe the world, what we would now call science. I think, Socrates and Plato and so on were big on the, philosophy should also be about human issues and human affairs, more so than about sort of the way the world works kind of thing, with the way the physical world works. But people, philosophers throughout history would have theories about how the world works. And they would have theories about how the world works, how it relates to how God works, because there was a lot of mixing between theology and philosophy for a long time. And then subsequently, I would say, people might say Francis Bacon was a person who, I think for perhaps partly political reasons, because he's quite a serious politician kind of person, was into the, let's do experimental science and believe only what we can, what we can do experiments on. But I think the real dividing line is probably Galileo and Newton. I think that's where sort of the big new idea of using math in a serious way to build the structure of science came in. I mean, the Babylonians had used math as a descriptive means to say, here's how we can interpolate the motion of planets, things like that. But I think the time when math gets used as a framework more so than pure reasoning is around, well, Galileo, 1630s, things like that, and then 1620s, and then Newton in 1687. This is Newton's book, his Principia. It's Principia Mathematica. Well, its full name is Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. The study of physics had been natural philosophy. This was a book that was kind of saying, these are the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, distinct from purely, Descartes and people like this that had theories of the world, but they were theories that were kind of more theories constructed by thinking about the world. I mean, Descartes had also worked on mathematics, but I don't think he merged those two in a very serious way. And I think he was still thinking about, vortices and atoms and things as a matter of the structure of the world, not something where you can reason about what's going on. So I think that's the time when the sort of mathematical tradition of natural science came in. That's when sort of science broke off from philosophy. Now, it's more difficult in other fields like economics, for example. Like where I grew up in Oxford, there's a lot of people learn, the PPE, philosophy, politics, and economics, as one of the degree courses. My mother used to teach that stuff. She was a philosophy professor in Oxford. That was, in a sense, things like, quotes, political science and economic science, which are now very sciencey presented things, for a long time were viewed as much closer to philosophy and viewed as much more fields where instead of, going down and writing down a math formula or something, one was instead reasoning in more the tradition of philosophy than the tradition of kind of the exact sciences and mathematics and so on. I mean, I think my own efforts actually in recent times, it's been interesting, the extent, it's sort of shocking to me, the extent to which some of the things we're figuring out about sort of this computational way of understanding the world and this multi-computational paradigm that I've recently been developing, how those relate to kind of questions in philosophy, the importance of consciousness in making sense of multi-computation, the questions like, why does the universe exist? Which I have to say, I think I now have a pretty decent handle on the answer to that question. And I've been kind of surprised that, to my knowledge, surprising philosophers have decided that question is just too hard. The why is there something rather than nothing question has been discussed a bit, but not much in philosophy. And that one is interesting because it is in some sense a very philosophical question, but it's actually been considered too hard for philosophy. And I think we now have something of a scientific answer, it's a fairly interesting scientific answer, that can explain both physics exists, the universe exists, why it has to exist, and mathematics also in some sense exists. And that relates to these questions about foundations of mathematics that I was alluding to. In any case, so I think the answer is late 1600s for most kinds of science. I would say that there are kinds of science that are still quite more reasoning based than they are kind of formalism based, so to speak. In fact, my own efforts in this kind of multi-computational paradigm might suggest some additional transitions that could happen in the future for some of these fields that traditionally haven't had a good kind of obviously scientific as opposed to philosophical tradition for how they're thought through. I must say that having, I would not diss the philosophical tradition, because actually I think in some cases people get drilled down into the very scientific traditions and actually completely lose sight of the bigger questions in particular fields of science. And a little dose of kind of more philosophical thinking, more kind of reasoning-based thinking would be a really good thing. And I think also, as we've understood more about this phenomenon of computational irreducibility that I first sort of started talking about in the mid-1980s, we're understanding the extent to which some of these sort of pure science approaches are necessarily limited. That sort of brings one back to these more sort of reasoning-based things. Okay, I'll talk. I have talked, I think, about the why is there something rather than nothing. That's a slightly complicated. I mean, I wrote a post about it a few months ago that I recommend. I think it's fairly well written. It's not a super simple topic, so I'm not going to try and cover it right now. Okay, there was one more question. All right, let me try one last question, and then we should wrap up. This is from Vikram. Why do I think that certain cultures have had such a disproportionate success in science discovery and in business? Oh boy. First of all, okay, there are kind of traditions that develop. I mean, cultures are in a sense a tradition of what's important, what's not important, what we care about, what we don't care about. And some cultures have cared more about intellectual, scientific kinds of things than others. Now, at some times in history, one might have said, well, that culture cares more about science. So what? Those guys are off being eggheads, doing their science and intellectual stuff and so on. So what? What matters in the world is having the best army, or what matters in the world is having the best devotion to some particular religious direction or whatever else. Who cares about all this kind of eggheady sciencey stuff? It so happens that we live in a time in history where the eggheady sciencey stuff has been important and has been an important part of kind of what's determined kind of a lot of what we get to use in technology. And that's been, if you look at the course of human history and you say, what's changed? You go look at a Greek play or something and you see about the issues that they're discussing. And it's like, that's human nature and it's the same. It's the exact same issues. With great precision, it's the same issues from a couple of thousand years ago than today. What's changed since that Greek play came out? Well, technology has changed. That's one very dramatic change. There have been some changes in patterns of thought about organizing society and things, but not so much. And it's been kind of cyclical. The one thing that has a real flow is the invention of things in technology and the kinds of things that are possible in technology. And so that's given, I think, that kind of the sort of those who've understood what it takes to make technology has turned out to be a disproportionately significant story of what different cultures deliver. And I think that's part of the reason that's been one of the issues. Now, there are other points, like there are some cultures where people routinely write books and publish them, where people put their accomplishments and put them on clay tablets like the Babylonians did. We know what the Babylonians did. We don't know what the Phoenicians did. Perhaps the Phoenicians did great things, but they wrote everything on papyrus and it's all gone now. The Babylonians, we happen to know what they did because it was on clay tablets. Now, I suspect the Babylonians were the big ones for sort of the eggheadery back in the day. I mean, people, the Chaldeans, as they're often referred to in sort of more poetic ways, people say, I'm going to consult the astrology, the Chaldean astrologer, and I'm going to, they're the mathematicians and so on. So probably the Babylonians really were a group that was that really had the significance that we think they had today, and it isn't just a matter of whose tablets got preserved, so to speak. Why did the Babylonians do this? Well, they were building cities. And when you build cities, you have to organize things, and you need to have land records, and you need to have systems of weights and measures and things like this. Things have to get kind of streamlined. And I think that's why the Babylonians pushed so hard to do those kinds of things. Now, at other times in history, sort of systematization has been something important for example, empires. Like, there were times when the Roman Empire was the sort of systematization. It's like you need to have a consistent set of money and weights and measures that extends across the empire, so to speak. And the same thing, I mean, I think the British Empire, same kind of story. The US, insofar as it's been a dominant power for the last 100 years or so, again, a lot of kind of defining of standards for the world. And I think those are things which, again, the desire to do that is something that will drive a certain amount of kind of sort of science-like thinking. Now, the other thing to say, it's an interesting question, particularly in Indian and Chinese kind of science and so on. There's a lot of questions about what was found out when. I was curious recently, a question that the idea of generative grammar, the idea that you can have sort of a systematic recursive way of specifying the grammar of languages. People say that a person called Panini, who was a Indian living maybe in the few centuries BC, invented such a grammar for Sanskrit. And it's like, well, did he or didn't he? And so I started actually looking, and it's like, well, he's got these books that are written as a bunch of aphorisms, and they're sort of examples, templates of grammar. But I don't know, did he really invent this or not? It takes real work to sort of back project from the way we're thinking about things today to see what was really invented back then. And it's a little different if there's a sort of single thread of the way things are presented. If it's presented as, I have many aphorisms, well, that's not the way, I don't know, maybe you could say Euclid is presenting sort of aphorisms about the axioms of geometry, but somehow we have they're a little bit more formal perhaps than these other kinds of aphorisms. It's hard to tell what was really there, what wasn't there. It also doesn't help that those things tended not to be dated. So it's just like, well, we have this thing, and we don't know whether it was from the 4th century BC or the 1st century AD. So there's a big kind of gap there. There's a big range there. And in terms of the flow of ideas, probably 10 years may not be much time across the civilized world, but 100 years certainly is. And so, in terms of figuring out what happened when, that's an issue there. I think that, when it comes to these kind of cultural things, there are cultural traditions when people have really cared about intellectual kinds of things. Why? Sometimes there are, religions that have been more into, let's go study the details of the sacred book, versus that's not the point. And, so that will lead to different kinds of emphasis on scholarship or not. And these are things that are, they're sort of, in a sense, extraneous factors. It's not that sort of, but eventually build up to some kind of cultural direction. And I think the same is true, in business. I mean, one knows very well from having done business around the world that, globalist as people might be, the fact is there's a lot of differences between different countries and their ways of doing business and the different attitudes towards business. There are countries where the idea that you start a company and it might fail is like so horrifying that nobody starts companies. And there are other places where it's like everybody's trying to make a deal all the time, and it's hard to, and there's nothing kind of fixed, and it's everybody's doing sort of custom bartering type deals, and that's just the way the culture is. And I think that it has, it's a big kind of important question for governments and sort of economic development. Why, for example, has the US been such a dominant country in technology, and particularly things like software development, relative to other countries in the world, particularly software development? It's one thing if you're making microprocessors and you understand, who understands the 5-nanometer process or whatever, and who has figured out, how to build this giant chain of machines that eventually get you to that kind of precision engineering. That's something that depends as a very history-dependent thing. When it comes to software, it's just ideas. And it's much less obvious why that should be concentrated in one place rather than another. And what you tend to see is there are very definite cultural differences between the kinds of things that people say that, the interface that will be kind of thought to be cute or cool or whatever in one country is different from another country. And I think, the US has had the advantage of having a large domestic market for software, for example, which has helped it, and there's a lot of other factors. But I think it's it's an interesting fact that, it's a more nurture than nature story in terms of, for example, software development in the US, because plenty of people, including myself, who have built software companies in the US didn't come from the US. It's not something where it's like something in the, in the water or something from earliest childhood or before or something. It's definitely a thing about the environment that has caused this to be possible in the US and not so much in other places. But I think in terms of the development of sort of the Western tradition of science and so on, it's partly that tradition happens to have fed very directly into the technology, the kinds of things that have been successful in technology, and that's definitely elevated that tradition over other ones. And I think that I'm much less knowledgeable about other traditions. I'm definitely a Western tradition kind of person in terms of science and other things about what I do. So I'm not nearly as familiar with other kinds of things, although people are always telling me that ideas that I have and have talked about in science resonate with particularly various kinds of Eastern traditions. And it's very interesting to me as I try to talk to people about those kinds of things, because there comes a point at which I'm like, I just don't really quite get it. And it's kind of like, I didn't grow up in that tradition. I'm just not used to. I don't have the kind of the mindset of thinking in those kinds of terms, and it's really hard to get there. And it's always a good reminder to me to see that kind of thing, because I've been responsible for inventing, I suppose, a few paradigms for thinking about stuff. And sometimes it's kind of like, hey, everybody, can't you understand this stuff? It's easy to understand. Look, I understand how this works. I can think in these terms. And it's always good for me to be reminded that there are sort of paradigms where you can present them. And I'm like, I really don't get this. I can't reason in this framework. It just doesn't make sense to me. I can't conclude, anything. You give me all these sort of pieces of some Eastern tradition, and it's like, and then say, and what does that mean for the world? And what does that mean for the nature of the world and why the universe exists or something? And I'm like, I don't know. I can't tell. I can't reason in this framework. All right. Well, I think we should wrap up there. I think we've got some good questions saved up for next time. But please do think of things to ask. I'm really happy to answer these things. And as I say, answering these questions helps me understand stuff. So I appreciate that very much. So thanks very much.